Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming out this evening and taking out some time, your personal time. And for all of those who are viewing us live on YouTube and Facebook, welcome. Thank you for watching this whenever you watch it. Today, I'm going to be doing a talk on the subject of metacognition. If you look up here, here's kind of a definition of metacognition: awareness and understanding of one's own thought process. Put very simply, it's about thinking about the way we think. Now, that might not sound like a very profound thing to do, but as we get into this discussion, I hope you recognize and see the value and importance of metacognition in the way that we think about and utilize our worldviews. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But to give you kind of an illustration of this metacognition, I wanted to tell a story. Very recently, I went to the barbershop to get a haircut. The black barbershop is every bit as much of what you've probably ever heard about it or what you think about it. There's a lot of banter. There's a lot of discussion about politics, about sports and things like that. It's typical thing that you think about when you think about the black barbershop. Now, it had been a while since the last time that I had been. And usually when I go to the barbershop, the conversation at my barbershop generally turns to boxing because I'm a big boxing fan. And so that's kind of my thing. Everyone knows that. They come in and that's their opportunity to talk about boxing. But this time it was just after the last presidential election. So the first question that I was asked was a question on who I voted for. It went something like this. My barber asked me, he said, "Hey, Chris, so did you vote for Donald Trump?" I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Good." He said, "So why didn't you vote for Donald Trump?" I said, "Well, there were a few character issues with him. I wasn't fully convinced that he was going to be the man that was going to do the things that he said that he was going to do. He had, flip-flopped his values over the years. And I just really wasn't convinced that Donald Trump, particularly with his character, was the type of person that I wanted to cast my vote for to be president." That was music to their ears because they don't like Donald Trump. He's kind of like a bad guy in their worldview. Then he asked me the follow-up question. He said, "Well, tell me you voted for Hillary." I said, "Of course not. You know me. You know I'm not voting for Hillary. I voted for a third party." He said, "Man, why didn't you vote for Hillary?" I said, "Well, I have some of the same concerns about her personal ethics, about her character. I also have concerns about her values when it comes to killing babies. I think she will, kill babies, and I just can't support something like that." And he said, "Kill babies? What do you mean about that?" And so I kind of explained it. I said, "Well, I'm talking about abortion. I think abortion is murder. And so I kind of get to the point of murder by calling it killing babies." And so then the discussion broke out in the barbershop with some of the other barbers and some of the patrons in the barbershop. They began to ask me, questions, and they began to challenge my view of abortion by asking questions and making comments. And so ultimately, the conversation boiled down to this argument or this point of, "Well, Chris, if you're not willing to adopt these babies, or if you're not willing to support government-ran welfare to take care of these babies, then I don't see why you have a problem with not aborting these babies. That's the best thing. That's the less trouble or consequences for society." And so basically, this was their argument. It was this boiled down reductionist argument of, if you're not willing to take care of them, then you should be glad and allow abortions to take place. And that was difficult for me to process. My first response was confusion. Like, are you serious? Did you hear what I said? Did you understand? We're talking about murder. That's if you agree with me that this is murder, how is it that you could support such an absurd idea that not being, me personally not willing to take care of them or support government-ran welfare would justify killing of human beings? I pressed back a little bit, and you don't want to know the next thing that came to my mind. it was something to the effect of this, you're missing something, buddy. Something's not there, because I don't see how that idea of me not being willing to adopt all these babies or support a system to take care of them that you think works, it justifies the taking of a life, the murder, the unjust taking of a life. So anyway, this talk isn't about abortion, so I hope no one gets sidetracked by that. This is just an event that happened that reignited in me the importance of this subject of metacognition, thinking about the way we think, because I thought something had to be wrong with the way that they were thinking for them to miss the obvious point that their worldview, the misstep that their worldview was making. So I really felt a little guilty for, kind of being, and actually I did make a kind of a condescending joke that day, which you should not do. I was wrong. That was inappropriate of me. I kind of took advantage of the fact that I have a relationship with these people, but I was really frustrated at the time because I felt at the time it was several of them against lonely me. And I felt like reason was on my side, and these guys were just hardcore giving it to me, and they were being unkind towards me with some of the things that they were saying. I kind of gave in to my flesh. But anyway, don't do that. But afterwards, I thought, man, I felt really bad, and I thought, well, we all would probably think, WWPD. What would Prince do? And what Prince would obviously do would be to give them some pancakes. So that's what I did. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't give them some pancakes. But it did, it did once again cause me to think about this type of conversation that led me to prepare this talk and to thinking about worldviews. I want to define worldview and talk about how metacognition works with worldview. So that's what we're going to do next. So all of us have beliefs about how the world should work. Some are smaller and more personal, like sweet potato pie or pumpkin pie. Others are big and impact others, like who should we vote for president? Or should we take in refugees? A worldview that a definition for worldview would be the lenses that influence the way we believe and interact with the world. So that's kind of the definition of worldview. The lenses that correct the way that we view, think about, and interact with the world. Excuse me. The best illustration that I could think of for worldview is probably the most common illustration. A worldview would be something similar to a puzzle with a lot of pieces. And think about each one of these pieces represents a different lens on a different subject that corrects the way that we view the world. Again, all of us has a worldview, but few of us think about them. So we all intuitively act in a mode in our worldviews, usually on some subconscious level. Now let's talk about some common things. Excuse me. Now let's talk about some common things that go into a worldview. What goes into a worldview? Worldviews affect the way that we think about morality. What's right, what's wrong? Is it okay to speed? Is that okay? Is that a morally okay thing to do? Is it okay to lie to a person? Is it okay to lie to your spouse? Is it okay to steal from someone? So morality is one of the big things that worldview impacts. That's one lens that we could kind of look at and think about. Another lens is religion. Should we go to church? Should we read the Bible? Should we read the Quran? Should we practice Hinduism, Buddhism? Religions, each of those religions influence the way that we look at the world, whether or not we help the poor, whether or not we are fair and just to our fellow man. So religion is another one of those lenses that is a part of the worldview puzzle. Politics, should we pool our resources? Should we be required to pool our resources to help out the rest of our fellow man within our nation or our country. To what degree is that acceptable? How much is acceptable, and at what point are we crossing some moral line of fair or just and unjust? Family traditions impact our worldview. Some people celebrate Thanksgiving, some people celebrate Christmas, some people don't. Every family has its own traditions. Some families get together every night for dinner, sit at a table, and talk about their day or what's going on in their life. Some families separate, go to their room, and eat dinner in front of a television. Their family tradition affects the way that our worldview. That's a lens. And then ultimately our experiences is part of what fuels our lens. Whether we think about these things consciously and we put effort into shaping these things and making sure that we are holding to actual good views, true views, or right views, or good values, or whether or not we just simply emote. We just go through life and allow the various things that influence our worldview to influence us, and for us to just try to navigate life, not really considering the implications of our worldview. For me, my experience is, each one of our experiences in some sense is very unique. My experience, as I reflect on it, is very significant in the American paradigm. For instance, I grew up raised by a single mother on welfare in the inner city of Detroit. And there were parts of my experience growing up that shaped who I am and the way that I think about and interact the world. As I became an adult and I began to work and get into my career, I kind of shifted and moved more into what's called middle class. And so now my neighbors are different, and I'm interacting with those, and their ideas are beginning to influence and shape me and the way that I view the world. So I kind of have this viewpoint that is, each one of our viewpoint in many ways are unique, but in my viewpoint, there are some common crossover areas that helps me to think about things in a way where they aren't as alarming to me. For instance, for me to talk about the subject of race I find it's not that hard for me to talk about it whether I'm in either group, whether I'm in a group of people that share my race, or whether I'm in a group of people that don't share my race. I'm quite comfortable talking about that because I've spent enough time in both environments for me to go through the uncomfortableness and to get to a point where I'm comfortable. But I know I have many friends who don't. I have many friends who would simply view an environment of a group of people of other culture as a hostile environment simply because those group of people don't have experience with those group of people, and they're not sure whether or not those group of people will have empathy for them, will understand and see things from their vantage point. And in many cases, they're suspicious that those people are against them, or they have some notion or ideas that are dehumanizing towards them. And so experience is a very unique and important part for us to think about that influence our worldview and the way that we interact with the world. Some other areas that my personal experience is, with church. I grew up in the inner city, and the church culture in the inner city is much different than the church culture that I'm experiencing now that I live in the suburbs. When I lived in the inner city, just this past Sunday, I was in a Sunday school class, and we were talking about spiritual gifts, and we were talking about, what types of gifts or what types of positions that aren't necessarily listed within the various groups of spiritual gifts. What was it, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Romans chapter 10, and Ephesians chapter 4, 12 and 12, and Ephesians chapter 4, and 1 Peter 4. Those are the four lists, but the list of gifts. And I said, well, hey, I grew up in churches where we had church mothers, and these church mothers were kind of like an official position. They wore these fancy hats. They sat up front. They helped to maintain integrity in the way that women dress. They helped to maintain correct behavior with the kids. If a kid got out of line, any mother in the church would come up and set that kid straight, sit them down, keep them from acting up, misbehaving during the service. So that's something that's unique that I haven't seen yet in a single suburban church. I haven't seen a church mother yet, but that's something that was a part of the church culture when we growing up. But once again, thinking about the way that we think. This is what we're talking about with our worldview. Now the question Sunday in Sunday school was, one of the questions was, should we consider gifts as spiritual gifts that aren't listed in the Bible? Are the lists in the Bible, the only gifts that exist, or are there gifts that aren't listed in the Bible? So, that's kind of an illustration of metacognition and thinking about the way we think. Another aspect of this worldview, thinking about worldview, or what are some of the modern worldview stumbling blocks? Here's one of the categories, or here's one of the areas where I think that we can really make a lot of progress in thinking about our own worldview, learning how to shape our own worldview, and understanding, sociologically, in a sense, why some people think the way that they think. For instance, I've had conversations where there are these presuppositional ideas that are injected to the conversation. Now, if I was to press and ask these people about these presuppositions, I'm fairly confident that they wouldn't agree that the way that they are presenting them or the way that they're using them is in that manner. But that's the way that they come across. For instance, the inerrancy of science. Often when we're talking about any particular issue of truth and there's some truth claim that science makes, there's this presumption that the truth claim that science makes is inerrant. It's correct. It can't be wrong. It's science. Now, we know that science is like any other field of philosophy or logic, to where as we as humans dig deeper and begin to learn and grow and understand these different fields better, things change. You got, Newtonian physics, and then you have relativity, Einstein's physics, and then you have quantum physics, and the more we learn, the way that we look at these things change, and we understand better the rules that apply to these ideas. So we know, when we really think about it and we really dig down, we realize that science is not inerrant. But it's not uncommon to get into a conversation on a subject where science has something to say, and for the conversation to go something like, well, haven't science already proven that evolution is true? And, whether or not that's true is what we're discussing, so how can you simply use that as your answer to the question? But that's what we presume. We sometimes presume the inerrancy of science. We also sometimes presume, another common stumbling block is we presume the infallibility of government. We think, okay, well, Chris, why do you have a problem with government-ran welfare? And I'll say something to the effect of, well, I don't think it's efficient. I don't think that it's a viable way to manage or to handle this particular problem. There's other problems that come from it. I'd much rather that be kind of a private entity, something to where it's local and it can be handled, more closely and monitored more closely, and the oversight is better. But that's not necessarily the response that I get. Often I get, why do you have a problem with the government? And I'm like, well, they're people just like anybody else. They make mistakes. And there's a long historical record of governments all around the world, all different types of governments, making bad decisions and causing problems for the people that they represent. But often I see people use this sense of infallible government as an argument to support whatever idea that they're advocating that the government should have access to, or the government should be managing. Religious beliefs and sacred cows. Think about, should we eat beef? Should we eat pork? There are certain presuppositions, or there's certain stumbling blocks within our worldview to where, from a very young age, people have been taught things about beef or about pork that as they become adults, even though they may never investigate or look into why it's good or bad or right or wrong that they do these things, they just have this predisposition against these ideas that they've never really tested or looked into. One of the biggest modern stumbling blocks to having meaningful conversations about worldview is the fact that we live in this chaotic age of mass media. And we have things like false news, or fake news, to where, there used to be 3-4 news networks, and you could look to ABC, NBC, you could look to these news networks, and they presented the news. They presented just the facts. There were 2 cars, one was heading north, one was heading south. At some point, these 2 cars collided. It's the police speculate that one person was a distracted driver. That's the news, just the facts. Now what we get often is spin. We get an editorialized edition of the news, but it's not given as an editorialized edition. It's where the person presenting the news tells us the facts, but the facts are told from the perspective of what they believe is true. There were two cars, one was heading north, one was heading south. The one that was heading south hit the one that was heading north, and the person was distracted. They were on their cell phone. When that may not be the case, the investigation is still underway, and we won't know what the facts are until the investigation is completed. But because the news gave us the facts, as if they were just the news and not an editorial, now we go off into the world, and as we interact with our friends and we share these stories, we share the editorialized version of the story instead of just the news, just the facts, what we actually know about the case. For me, this is one of the harder ones to deal with, because often what you see with illustrations like this is these days is video recordings. Some event will happen. There'll be a video recording, 2, 3, 10 minutes of the action we get to peer into. And then it's easy for us to feel like we've seen all of the facts, but we don't know what happened prior to this video started. We don't know what happened after. And unless there's something that is unquestionably, unmistakably wrong that we see in the video, it's easy for us to feel like we have seen the facts and we are making a fair and right and just judgment when we're talking about these things. And that can often lead into one of these other ones, groupthink, to where a large part of the population becomes persuaded of something being right, and that sociologically affecting those who are undecided to just join the group because this large group. And I don't think we necessarily think about groupthink when we join groupthink. I think it's just we want to fit in. We want to be comfortable. It's something about being a part of something, being human and being a part of something that resonates with us, that makes us feel comfortable. And so we quickly gravitate toward groups, and that can often backfire on us and cause problems for us if we're not thinking and aware of the fact that we're practicing groupthink and we're allowing the group's way of thinking to affect our worldview. That can quite quickly be a stumbling block. Another very common one is reductionist thinking. A great example of these are memes. Memes tell the story in a way that's supposed to point out the poignancy of an idea or the absurdity of an idea, but unfortunately, we sometimes take large, complex ideas and reduce them to a meme and allow that meme to influence in the way that we think. And this is problematic because, once again, worldview is the way that we interact with the world. And if we've allowed that meme, if we've allowed that fake news, if we've allowed that groupthink to influence us, our behavior is going to reflect that as we interact with the world. And it's going to show when we make big decisions, when we vote for who we're voting for president. That's when this type of thing is going to show. When we decide, what church am I going to go to? That's when these big things are going to show. When we decide what's acceptable. And we see it in modern culture. We see the effects of it in modern culture and the way that many churches today are turning away from traditional views because they're unpopular. Not because they've investigated and determined that something was mistaken or those views are wrong. They're turning away from those views because those views aren't popular. And so they're kind of falling into the stumbling block of groupthink. Hey, what's popular? Let's shift our paradigm to fit what's popular so that we keep people coming to us, or we keep relationships going. So these are some of the modern stumbling blocks, and there's plenty of others. In all of these categories that I'm presenting in, there's plenty of other ideas that could equally be pointed out how problematic that they are. But these were some of the ones that were pretty common, that I see quite often, that as I engage with people, and I see how people engage with one another on media platforms like Facebook. These are some of the things that I see that are very alarming. And I think that if we took the time to reflect, if we took the time to practice metacognition, thinking about the way we think and interact with the world, and begin to work towards interacting with the world or shaping our worldview rather than just allowing the world to shape us in our worldview and the way that we interact with the world, that especially us as Christians, we would be much better off. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about us as Christians and how we interact with that in a few minutes, because that's ultimately the purpose of this talk. The purpose of this talk is to help us as Christians change. It's to point out a problem, the problem being we don't think enough about the way that we think about it when it comes to our worldview and the way that we interact with the world. The solution for us as Christians, first of all, there's some Bible verses, one of which I wanted to read to kind of highlight this. And actually first, there are two different parts of the equation when we're talking about worldview. There's us and there's them. There's my worldview. How do I take this information and what can I do with this information to reflect truth, to honor God, to behave in a way that brings honor to God rather than to continue to behave in a way that's just a microcosm of the culture. I'm behaving just like anyone else. There's no distinction. There's no distinction between me and a person who has any other religion or who is simply secular. There should definitely be a difference with us as Christians. Then the them part. When we get into these conversations, we can recognize that sometimes rather than continuing a discussion on that subject, if a person's not equipped to have that discussion, maybe it may be best for us to subtly change the discussion to metacognition. Not in a sense where you're saying, hey, do you metacognition? Have you thought about the way you think? But more so, start to scale back the conversation from the actual point that you're actually discussing and kind of change the focus to how you got to those conclusions. And that's one way to kind of subtly, slowly over time to shift things to where we're having much more meaningful conversations. Because I can tell you this much, I've had plenty of meaningless conversations. I've had plenty of conversations where me and others were simply just talking past one another. We weren't really listening to one another. I was convinced I was right. They were convinced they were right. And they spent their time, their energy simply trying to convince me of my error. And I likewise trying to convince them of their error rather than having genuine, meaningful dialogue that moves along. For us as Christians, there's a couple of passages in Proverbs that I wanted to read because I think they help to capture also I'm going to stop this. I think they help to capture also the spirit to which we as Christians should act in, the way that we should think and engage culture and engage others with. So both of these passages are in Proverbs. The first is in Proverbs chapter 8, very popular passage on wisdom. First 8 chapters of Proverbs really set the tone for the rest of Proverbs. And Proverbs is can either be one of those books that you look at and you find great value in because you're maturing and you recognize the great wisdom that exists in the book of Proverbs. Or Proverbs can be boring because it doesn't flow very well. They're kind of often independent thoughts, and if you're not maturing, it's probably not going to be very appealing to you. But I'm going to be in Proverbs 8, going to be reading from verses 13 through verse 17. And once again, I encourage you, read Proverbs. At the very least, go home, read Proverbs 8. Very, very good passage of scripture. Starting at verse 13. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior, and perverse speech. Counsel and sound judgment are mine. I have insight. I have power. By me, kings reign and rulers issue decrees that are just. By me, princes govern and nobles all who are rule on the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me find me. And that's speaking from the perspective of wisdom anthropomorphically. I love those who love me, and those who seek me will find me. And those who find him, they rule justly. They think right. That's ultimately the point that's being made there in Proverbs chapter 8. Next, I want to go to Proverbs chapter 18 and just read one verse. Not necessarily as popular, but every bit as much wise and helpful. And this one states, casting the lot settles disputes. Excuse me, this is 18 and 19. A brother wronged is more unyielding than a fortified city. Oh, I'm sorry. I have the wrong, I have that backwards. I think it's 19 and 18. Excuse me. Oh, I'm going to have to come back to that one. I didn't fact check. But yeah, I'll get that other one for you and get it out to you guys. But once again, Proverbs chapter 8, verses 13 through 17, speaking about wisdom. We as Christians, we should pursue wisdom. We should pursue engaging with culture and engaging with others in an honorable way and in a way that seeks to know truth. In closing today, I have a couple of quotes, one from the Bible and another from Grisham Machen, a quote that I saw recently in a blog that was, very timely. It's on the subject that we're going to be talking about today. So the first quote reads, "False ideas are the greatest obstacle to the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there. If we permit the whole collective thought of the nation or of the world to be controlled by ideas which prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion." Once again, that was by Grisham Machen. And the second quote is kind of like the apologist creed of sorts. It's 1 Peter 3:15. And this one states, "But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." And really one of the things that I love about that verse there is that ending part with gentleness and respect, because I often think that's what's missing in dialogues with Christians. One of the worst times of the year is when I see is around every 4 years when we're electing a president, and I see very well-meaning, very genuine people who are really entrenched in their own position, in their own ideas, and not really willing to be open and discuss things the way that they engage with one another. It's such a sad affair. And I'm sure that some people, when those same people turn and they start talking about the Bible and they start talking about the gospel, I'm sure some of the people who they're reaching out to think about that, like, man, you're one of the meanest people I know. They may never say it to your face, but if they've seen it, that's the type of thing that crosses people's minds. Lastly, also, from my own personal experience in conversations and in dialogues when talking about big picture parts of worldviews, religion and politics in particular, one of the things that I've noticed is often the person that I'm talking to is not necessarily the person that my message is reaching. Often I've had it to where I'm speaking to a person, they're speaking to me, we're speaking past each other to our disgrace, and some third party who's not even in my radar, who I'm not even thinking about, messages me or walks up to me at church on Sunday, or, calls me and says, "Hey, I saw you talking to so-and-so the other day. You mentioned this, and I never thought about that before, and that made sense to me. And now I'm thinking more about this point or this particular subject here." Whereas the person who we're often engaging with, they've got skin in the game. They're invested, and they're kind of in this battle of ideas. And so it's sociologically hard probably for that person to switch positions midstream when they're making this public declaration of the opposing view that you offer. On other scenarios that happen like that for me is like I meet with my buddy for breakfast every Sunday in Bible study, and often enough, someone from the next booth over will hear something that we're talking about, and before we leave, they'll say, "Hey, I heard you guys talking about this. I never thought about that," or "This made a difference to me, and now I'm thinking about that." Once again, a person, not even the audience that I was aiming at, who didn't have had their guards down because they weren't necessarily engaging in the battle of ideas at that moment, was able to be persuaded or helped along the way in some sense because they were listening in. And so I also want to just encourage people to keep that in mind. Remember, when you're having dialogues on worldview, when you're trying to share the gospel, when you're talking about politics, when you're talking about these important ideas, lenses that shape our worldview, remember the character part. Do this with gentleness and respect. Remember that character part. Thank everyone for coming out tonight, listening to me talk, and thank everybody for tuning in. And at this point, for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to do like a Q&A kind of discussion. So if you have any questions about anything that I said during my talk, or if you have any general worldview questions, I know I have some friends here who are apologists in their own right that would be more than happy to share on any subject that I'm not qualified to respond to. For the next 10 minutes, we can kind of talk about the subject, the talk metacognition, and any worldview issue that I kind of brought up or that piqued your interest while we're talking. So, any questions? And some of the groups online might have a question too, so kind of watch and see if anybody pops up any questions on there also.
Chris, do you think this is something that people are getting either worse and worse at, or maybe even better and better? So an example is the news. Is it possible that the news was always biased and we just didn't know it, and we're just more in tune to that sort of thing? And I think maybe like an example is that maybe that we're getting worse is like, think of like Facebook, it divides people into groups, and if you like a certain kind of group that has the kind of news that you like, from the angle where it won't tell you that two cars smashed, but this one was a Trump supporter, it's his fault, or
right.
Vice versa, that if you do that, then you'll get invited to a bunch of other groups that are the same. So that's the only news you get. You've built a safe little bubble that protects your metacognition from ever being penetrated by like facts.
Well, the last thing that you said, that's kind of my fear. My fear is that culturally, we're kind of in this groupthink system to where we're building these bubbles. It used to be like you can watch videos from the 70s and 80s where people of opposing views had dialogue, and even they didn't agree. On Our Bible and Beer, where Shane posted that video with young Bernie Sanders, right? And so Bernie, right? The entire crowd wasn't interjecting and booing and preventing one side from speaking, but we see that a lot more today. We're constantly seeing it on the news. One side is often being censored while the other side is being triumphed and promoted. And so I guess it's looking at how much more common, whether it's the lack of media in the past that didn't highlight the fact that this exists as bad as it does now, or if it's we're changing. I guess I lean a little bit more toward we're changing. It's not to say that there haven't been biased media outlets or organizations throughout past. I mean, we're human. And just about every bad, sinful way that we can corrupt something, we do that. And so I'm sure it's always been along, but maybe it's just my perception, but it seems like it's getting worse. And now we are creating those bubbles, and that's what's making it worse. And that's what I'm trying to dispel. That's what I'm trying to encourage people to be countercultural against. Don't fall into the trap. Don't fall into the stumbling blocks. Metacognition. Think about your worldview. You shape your worldview. Don't allow your worldview to shape you.
Chris, what are some of the fundamental differences between types of worldview? And how can we know how our worldviews compare to others when we're in conversations?
Okay. The list of stumbling blocks, I guess, I think one of the challenges is that for secularists, there are things, or non-religious people, there are things like science, there are things like a political affiliation and popular subjects that really shape the way that they view the world. And sometimes you can, you can hear it. As a person speaks, you can kind of hear these trigger words. Well, Trump could be a trigger word. If a person's speaking in a very flattering way about Trump, or if a person is speaking in a very degrading way about Trump, most of us would probably have some initial idea about, where this person's what some parts of this person's worldviews are, the way that they're shaped. So I think that if we, as we grow and practice metacognition, as we begin to learn of people's, learn about some of the distinctions of the various worldviews, there is going to come a point to where we are able to have kind of some discernment when we're having conversations with people. And, we can take that, from that discernment, we can often kind of develop a plan to engage with that person so that we can have a more meaningful conversation rather than to allow that person's worldview to, simply that person just to share their worldview and you to share your worldview and you really not have a genuine dialogue. I'm not sure. I think that kind of answered your question. If it didn't, follow up and kind of push back a little bit, because that's the way I understood what you were asking.
Well, on a similar note, though, how can we evaluate our own worldview? Like, how do we look at it and see if there's any malfunctions or dysfunctions in it?
Well, all of us have dysfunctions. We're human. To human is to err, someone once said. I mean, we all have our blind spots. There's this. In human resources, there's this talk that you have with a person that you're trying to talk about a sensitive subject, maybe like BO or something like that. Okay, so you say, hey, there's these 4 squares. There's these things that you know about yourself that everyone knows about you. It's like we see you, and you know yourself, and everybody sees you. That's square A. Then there's square B. Square B is things that you know about yourself and the people that are closest to you know about you. Maybe your birthday, maybe what your favorite food is. That's square B. Then there's square C. There's things that other people know about you that you may not even know about that other people know about you that I can't remember what square C was. But then square D is the things that everybody know about you that you don't know. That's BO, that's the thing. So, all of us have these blind spots where we don't know. And there's virtually nothing we can do about that but to be learners, be life learners. And as life learners, some of those things will rise, we'll learn about them. Now, on the flip side of the things that we do know about, some of the things that we can do is to identify people who think well, generally speaking, and people who can help us to think more critically about our own worldview. For me personally, one of those entities was Greg Koukl and Stand to Reason. I had never really considered the philosophical aspect of Christianity or theology prior to bumping into Greg Koukl. Prior to that, I thought from the perspective of theology and secularism. That's basically how I thought. And there was very little crossover between these two ideologies. But he got me to think more critically so that, some of the presuppositions that I had been given growing up, or as I kind of started reading the Bible on my own, he got me to think more critically about these things. So, finding people that are good thinkers that can trust, and good thinkers are good thinkers because they draw right conclusions. And that's kind of a, hard thing to maybe grasp hold of. But I mean, ultimately, that's the case. You listen to a person, they're going to consistently make sense. Bad thinkers, you're going to have lots of questions because these people at times they're going to be saying things that don't make as much sense. For me, some of the recommendations I have stand to reason when it comes to things like politics and religion. I like listening to The Briefing by Al Mohler. Although I have some disagreements theologically with the people who run the coalition, what's that called? The Gospel Coalition. Generally speaking, they do some good stuff there. They do lots of good, like personal growth, and they do a lot of good work at the Gospel Coalition. So, those are some of the things, people or organizations that I look to personally. So if there's some complicated issue that comes up and I'm trying to get a grasp of it because I want to be able to engage culture and talk about these things, those are some of the organizations that I personally go to. None of them are inerrant either. We're human, we all make mistakes, but generally speaking, I think they draw some good conclusions in the areas that they focus in. Any other questions?
It's just by coincidence, maybe, that the other day I was reading through Timothy Keller, Making Sense of God. I don't know if you read that or not, but I actually ended up typing this email to some people in my Bible study because we had this discussion earlier, similar discussion. And I basically quoted from the book. It said, we should have as many good reasons for what we believe as possible. However, there's both an objective pole and a subjective pole to knowledge. Social scientists have argued that we arrive at what we consider to be truth through a range of methods, including analytical thinking, experience, empathy, or mentalizing, and intuition. Augustine understood that reason and faith work always together, and that reason always operates under the guidance of antecedent belief. So belief that you already had guides your thinking, is what you're saying, right? So that's where you need to move to, I think, is what you're talking about, is you moved to how do you break that antecedent belief and get them to think through things honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That's what metacognition is. Metacognition, and it's not that the anteceding things are always wrong. It's that when you don't test ideas, you never know. You really don't. And how much, and some of these ideas require very deep commitments. And so you have to ask yourself, is this commitment worth it? Sometimes socially, when you think about religions like Islam, and some religions that are very, that demand a lot of you, where you're going to be, cut off, excommunicated. If you simply apostatize from these religions, you're going to be excommunication. You're not going to have a family. You're not going to have a circle that supports you. And so it's hard for some people to question those ideas. It's just so much easier just to kind of go with the flow and keep that social circle and make their life as easy as they can. But if truth actually matters, then we should all have this deep commitment to it. We should all have this deep commitment to recognizing that not having truth ultimately will cost us something. Something small. If I'm never willing to try that pumpkin pie, I might never know the tasty deliciousness of pumpkin pie because I was so satisfied with sweet potato pie. But other times it's life itself. When you think about the gospel, what's at stake? If Paul, 1 Corinthians 14 says, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we're to be pitied more than all men. There's truth there that Paul says, hey, listen, this is true. This is objective. This is not some subjective idea. This is true, and if it's not true, then we should abandon it. We should have no loyalty or commitment to it. So,
question from Facebook: nominal and cultural Christians often do not hold to a biblical worldview when it comes to politics and social issues. How would you confront them in their era?
I'm not sure if I mentioned this. It was in my notes. I might have skipped over it because I kind of got off and was just kind of going with the flow from, being familiar with the notes. But we have to remember, people move slow. For me, I didn't overnight become the person who I am today. If I really look back over the last 20 years, there's been a ton of transformation, both in my character as well as in what I believe about the world, what I believe about politics, and what I believe about religion. I used to have a very defensive posture toward church membership. I used to think, why are they trying to control me? Why are they trying to dictate to me what I should do? Now I have a very strong conviction that I should have a deep commitment to the church, and I should have a deep commitment to submitting to the church. And I'm not talking about a perfect church. I'm not talking about finding the perfect. I'm talking about finding a reasonably led church And I should submit myself to that authority. Even in cases where I feel like I'm 100% right and they're 100% wrong, it is more important for me to submit myself to that authority and to be a part of that local body and fellowship where there's accountability than it is for me to be separated and alone. So I don't allow the imperfections of the church to discourage me. But it took a while for me to get to that point. So what I would say is learn to be patient. Nothing thwarts the will of God. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if a person is a genuine follower of Christ, they're going to be on a constant trend of learning and growing. Just be patient with them. Same thing with politics. You know, I didn't come to my views, my political views overnight. As a matter of fact, the first, when I was growing up, I remembered like the president, because like in elementary school, they always taught you, hey, you want to be the president one day. That's what they would do in elementary school, first, second, third grade teacher. That's what they're telling you. You want to be the president one day. But the first memory that I have of political rhetoric was that Ronald Reagan was this, Satan has been elected as president. That's the first, rhetorical memory that I have of politics, to where someone, rather than simply speaking about a position, actually was talking about politics, talking about the logic and the reason of politics. And so, at the time I didn't know, but guess what? Everybody in my neighborhood and everybody in my circle, this was kind of the talk. So that was kind of my adopted belief that I came out into, political rhetoric with. As I began to learn more about the inner workings of government and politics, I shifted quickly. I vividly remember, having very positive views about even Bill Clinton for most of his term. But as I began to get into politics, I began to talk more about it. I began to think more about it. I began to think about the implications. Over the last 20 years, my views have shifted significantly to where, I think that even conservative people look at me and say, well, we don't want to go that far, Chris. I'm very conservative and I'm very libertarian. I want freedom. I want you out of my business. I want to have the freedom to do the things that can bring me the pursuit of happiness that I think we were set up for. So just be patient. Recognize that people don't change overnight. People move slowly. Have some patience. You're much more likely to help that person along in the way that they think about those things by having some patience, maintaining friendships, and talking about those things in friendly manners than you are to take a hostile posture toward them and to isolate them from you and to allow them to be in a greater way influenced with those bad ideas. Because that's ultimately what you're doing. When you separate from those people, you're forcing them further into the bad ideas and you're taking away the influence, the positive influence of the good ideas. So be patient, love that person, have relationship with that person, and hopefully over time, if what you believe is true, that person will gravitate toward the same conclusion because that's what's true, that's what's right. Well, thank you all again for coming out. Thanks for sharing. Hopefully, those of you who are watching on Facebook, hopefully you benefited from this, and YouTube, you benefited from this, and you'll see a value in sharing this video with others and having discussions around the topic of this video of metacognition. Thank you and good evening.